Hello, listeners. I'm Hal. I am going to be hosting this little session. I'm here joined by the Stars Are Right cast from all three Cults of Cthulhu scenarios. And we're joined for this first part of the episode by the actual writers of Cults of Cthulhu, Chris Lackey and Mike Mason. Thank you very much for being with us, gentlemen.
It's great to be here. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely.
We're very pleased to have you both. And we've got a list of questions we've compiled from listener submissions and also some that we had for both of you. I'm going to attempt not to retread too much ground that you've already covered in. I know there's been another couple of interviews that are out there on the web about this. But to the best of my ability, we'll see how we go. I also appreciate the book has been out for quite a long time, so we'll try not to quiz you too hard on stuff that you were probably thinking about several years ago while you were writing it, but we'll see how we go. I've got the questions in front of me, so I'll be asking them, but I do invite anybody to jump in with follow-up questions, etc. It doesn't just need to be me talking. We're going to start with Chris and Mike. Well, we've got them, like I said, talking about the creation of the Cults of Cthulhu book and all sorts of good stuff. And then we will get into stuff that's specific to the Stars Are Right playthrough afterwards. So let's kick things off. Can we talk about the origins of the book? I saw you mentioned elsewhere, Mike, that you had the idea, I think, and I'm quoting you here, Mike, you twisted Chris's arm into getting into the project. Does that sound about right?
I'm sure that's mostly true. I will let kind of Chris give his version, but I mean, for a time, I am very conscious of the lack of Cthulhu in Call of Cthulhu. Very rarely makes an appearance, if ever, and the game is now 41 years old. And I felt that as we were coming up to the 40th anniversary, this was a few years before then, that wouldn't it be quite good if we had a book that was solely about Cthulhu finally? And so that was in the back of my mind. And then by happy chance, I was at Dragon Meet, the convention in London, which takes place early December every year. And myself and Chris were chatting. And I very cavalierly suggested to Chris that he would be a great person to write a book about the Cult of Cthulhu. And, then I perhaps should pass over to Chris and he can tell it from his side of the fence, as it were.
I remember that pretty much the way that Mike said. We were at Dragon Meet. It was, he goes, "Oh, I want to do something with you. What would you be interested in? Cthulhu? We want to do a Cthulhu thing, maybe a cult. Focus on cults and humans." And I go, "Oh, that sounds great," because there really isn't any sort of material just for cultists, and cultists are a big part of the mythos stuff, and specifically the story, The Call of Cthulhu, which the game, is called. So I said, that's a great idea, and I got really excited about it, and then we started talking, and then I think Mike, I wouldn't say twisted my arm because I was pretty keen on it. We agreed to do it. And so from there, we just kind of figured out what we wanted in the book. And I think it was emails back and forth about chapters and what we wanted in there and the exact structure of it. And that just kind of got bandied back and forth. And then we just kept filling in more and more details. And then it was finally sit down and just write the darn thing.
Which was pretty easy to do, wasn't it, Chris?
It was a breeze. As a writing project, I thought it was actually really smooth sailing initially. It was when we got to the adventure parts that things really slowed down, because when you get to that, you've got playtesting involved, and it's complicated because you're writing now for somebody else's game that they're going to play. And just doing research and being able to write the first major section of the book, I think that was much more accessible and attainable of a goal. But once the actual modules were to be written, then it was like, well, what if they do this? Well, what if this happens? What if? And you don't have to worry about that so much when you're just writing a history of Cthulhu mythos or coming up with characters or cults or any of those things. So that was by far the toughest bit. And I think, if I remember correctly, Mike, I was pretty much on schedule with deadlines up until we hit those adventures. And then things really started slowing down.
You're absolutely right. It was all, as you say, the first, maybe not 2/3, first half of the book. It was all going swimmingly. And then I seem to remember getting the odd email from you going like, oh man, this scenario writing, it's far harder than I remember, kind of thing.
Yeah, it's, because when you're playing with your local group and you're just coming up with stuff off the top of your head or just planning a little bit, you can sort of wheel and deal as you're doing it. But when you're actually writing something down that people are going to be able to sit and think about, and that they have to run it for their players. So there's that extra step that you have to think about. It's like, well, what's going to be the problem that this keeper is going to have with this particular story, or where might the characters go? And it's that process, which is so time consuming, because you really have to second, third, and fourth guess everything that you put down in a scenario that is for print. I mean, if you want to do it right, obviously.
I'm wondering, what was the collaboration for writing the scenarios? Like, was it mostly you, Chris, and then Mike kind of contributed and edited and gave ideas, or was it more 50-50? How was the spread between how much each of you did?
I think I wrote the first drafts of everything, but then it got complicated after that. And then Mike stepped in, and I think Paul Fricka was also, he rewrote quite a bit of the last one as well.
Oh, he's one of the and friends credited on the... Okay.
Oh,
and friends,
Paul
yes.
is a friend.
Is that right, Mike?
That's right.
Because Mike did the edit, so he knows exactly how much everybody did.
Chris is absolutely right. Chris did the entire first draft of everything. And because, from my point of view, I wanted Chris to have the freedom to express the book as he saw it, and as we'd kind of agreed it up front. And then really my job was to look for gaps and opportunities where we may have not, maybe have missed something, or we want some further depth into a particular, aspect of the Cthulhu cult. And with the scenarios, what I tend to do with scenarios is, either I get into the bones of them and, really, go through them with a fine tooth comb to sort of check the logic flow and all the rest of it, or I get somebody else to do that, and then I come on. And in this case, I asked Paul Fricka to basically do a first kind of editorial pass on the scenarios, so mainly to kind of problem spot, because it's that, when you're writing a scenario yourself, you don't see the wood for the trees, and often you just need a fresh pair of eyes to kind of go, oh, this all makes sense, the logic flow is all fine until we get to this bit, and suddenly we make an assumption that means the players would go to here, when in fact they may not go to there because we're making an assumption, and so forth. And so Paul went through and kind of checked the logic through, and did like a second draft. This was while I was working on the first half of the book, going through and editing and developmental editing that text. And so by the time I'd finished that, Paul had finished 3 scenarios, and then I did my what you call a third pass on the scenarios, and was really testing the logic flow in them, testing the kind of what would the players do now kind of mindset. I guess I'm reasonably experienced to kind of think like a player when I'm reading a scenario that I haven't written, and basically apply that to kind of go, oh, okay, I think players could also do this here, which we haven't covered. We need to kind of build that in. Or it may be, I'm thinking of Loki's Gift. I think there's two kind of toughs that are kind of minding the composer, and I think that was pretty much a fairly throwaway line in the original kind of first couple of drafts, but I felt that we needed to kind of beef them up and give the keeper some options of what they would do if the players, start talking to them or attack them and so forth. So I think little areas like that where I'd beef it up and maybe develop some further material and so on. And also in the final scenario in the God's Dream, there's a particular way that it's presented in terms of the role of, well, I guess the role of Great Cthulhu in the scenario. And I could see that would be great for some groups, but I think some groups would find that very constraining or difficult to embrace. And so what I did was provide alternative reasons why certain things might happen in the scenario the way they do, and so forth. So I wasn't really changing the scenario. I was really just looking to kind of add some more depth and some more variations in terms of options that might happen as and when, you know, certain things occur. But that's kind of the process that we go through for pretty much every scenario we put out through Chaosium, to be honest.
Those two Loki's gift tufts became like quite big NPCs for us, actually.
Seesaw. We had callbacks for episodes and episodes.
Seesaw was the strongest man ever to live. He was great.
We were all very fond of him.
I do not remember how much of that I made up. I was going to say about A God's Dream, I think our group enjoyed the kind of Cthulhuvian intervention. I don't think people felt like railroaded by it. Sorry, I have one final question following up from this, and it is, I've been wanting to know who came up with a Carl Day hook and the Antarctica and not Antarctica at the same time, because that might be my favorite
a good hook
in a scenario so far.
That was all Chris.
Chris, congrats.
Oh, thanks. I'm glad you liked it.
It was inspired, yeah.
It was inspired.
It really got our motor running.
It really was. It was just so surprising.
Well, with him talking to us on the phone after he'd been found in Antarctica, it blew our minds.
They loved it. And I loved it. As soon as I read the beginning, I was like, yes, this is great. That's a hook.
Speaking of blowing, that's the world's worst segue, and I'm sorry. I really am sorry. I wanted to go from blowing minds to blowing things up, but I did it clumsily.
All right.
I appreciate the playtesting must have been absolutely ages ago, Chris, but we were curious if any particularly fun stuff happened in playtesting, and specifically, what was the most spectacular use of the explosives that the players are given in A God's Dream? Because you're not often given a load of C4 in a scenario.
No, I think, well, a lot of them didn't use it. That was one of the things that I thought was strange. When in the games that I playtested, people were scared to use it for some reason, and I'm not sure why. But in 2 of the playtests that I did, they blew up the lab, which is what I thought they would do. The lab that was actually on another planet. Is that how it ended up?
That's what we did, yeah.
Good, okay, yes, yeah. Yeah, they went down there and they totally blew the whole thing up and got out of there. I think with most of their sanity intact, that group.
Not so much.
Yeah.
Yeah, they did better than us in that case.
When I first read that, because occasionally very occasionally in the scenario, you'll come to this point where they go, and then the investigators get these machine guns or explosives or whatever it is. And I have to take a shark and take a breath and go, okay, let's continue reading and see what happens. And sometimes, they mysteriously disappear out the scenario because I think the potential for calamity is too high. Whereas in this one, given all the other strangeness that the PCs are kind of exposed to, throughout this scenario in particular, it just seemed to fit really well because it is kind of, because I could imagine exactly what, Chris said in his group with the, they're given exposure, but they don't want to use them. They don't know what they're going to do. This is some sort of trap. It's a trick. And so I thought that would work really well because it would pose a quandary for the players. And often, with good Call of Cthulhu scenarios, what you're looking to do is to pose some sort of challenge to or question to the players, which, seemingly is an easy answer, but maybe it's not. And so, that kind of generates debate at the table and it's all good fun.
And that was what happened in those other playtests. The ones that were hesitant or didn't do it at all was like, wait, this all seems like we're being manipulated. I don't think this is right. And then they had that debate. And one of them was like, no, these are obviously bad guys making place somehow I could walk from one building and I'm on another planet. That's not right. We've got to blow this place up. And it's like, no, it seems like we've got to blow things up, but we don't. And then that went on for too long. And then you throw some monsters at them to stop them from fighting about it.
It's funny. I think we pretty quickly decided that we were going to blow them up. It didn't take us long at all.
Well, that's because you had baby Cthulhu whispering in your ear.
Oh,
Telling you
that's
what to do, and he was your baby. So
It wasn't enough to blow the place up either. We strapped the explosives literally to ourselves as suicide vests.
just in case.
Whoa!
We thought it would be a good bargaining chip.
Wow.
It's worth saying, maybe for Chris's benefit, that 3 of the 4 of us took the Mythos Experience package for the start of A God's Dream, so we were already fairly far gone by the end of it.
There was a lot of bouts. I think it was probably the scenario where we had most of our favorite bouts, I'd say, of madness.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Good escalation.
Definitely.
Absolutely.
Speaking of favourites, in writing the scenarios, did you have a favourite era you were writing for, and did you consider any other eras or locations other than the 3 that made it in?
No, I mean, those seem like the go-to times, periods, at least, and not the locations, but the periods in time. You've got a Gaslight Cthulhu, you've got 1920s Cthulhu, you have modern day Cthulhu. But the locations, I think I was trying to change it up a bit. London, obviously, well, it's London, so that's not new. But setting something on the West Coast, I feel like there's not a lot of stories written in the west part of America, especially Los Angeles. And Los Angeles in the 1920s was a zany place. There was lots of crazy people going out there because it was this promised land. People wanted to be in movies, and lots of people couldn't be in movies, so they just found these weird communities. And if you read about that history, that kind of that migration that happened out to specifically Los Angeles, it was a very bizarre time. And a lot of that is ripped from history. A lot of those ideas from that particular story were borrowed from a few different things that were going on at the time. And then I think we, for the last story, was it also Los Angeles? And then Mike said, no, we shouldn't do Los Angeles again. And I'm like, yeah, you're right. And then we either talked about New York or Chicago. I'm trying to remember. It ended up in Chicago, I know, but I don't remember what the exact process was, but there was some back and forth about that last place.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I'm from Illinois. So I know Chicago fairly well.
And I think that's probably why we ended up stumping for Chicago, because of you can't, the value of having the local knowledge is immense when you are, particularly a modern day scenario as well, knowing where things are and how they connect is it makes the scenario writing process easier. And by that time, Chris, I think I was just trying to help you to get through the final scenario.
Yes, you're right.
Do either of you guys have like a fantasy location or time period that you'd really love to write for, but it's just a bit too niche?
Boy, that's I know I haven't thought about it. I'm pretty set in my modern day and 20s Cthulhu, and I've played some Middle Ages before, and I think it's just too different of a time period. Like life was too different in the Middle Ages for me to really connect to those characters in that place. And to try and keep it historically accurate, there is a great book I was reading called 500 AD, or is it AD 500, where it's a travel log written by some people from Constantinople that are looking to go back to the British Isles to see if it's viable to be taken back by the empire. And this 580, so Rome has fallen, and they're going to kind of check it out. So it's this travel log of them going all around, and it's such a weird, different culture, and all the because they were worried about the Saxons at that time, and there was one of the things I remember was in Ireland, to show fidelity to a lord or anybody, to get protection, a man, you would have to suckle his nipple. To show.
Okay.
Oh yeah, there's all these and it was really common, and anybody that was up. So as foreigners, they would have to find somebody that would protect them, and to show that they were protecting them, they would suckle their nipple.
That's how I've gotten every promotion at work.
But there's so many bizarre people were so different back then. It's just a different. There was another one I remember where they visited this village, and part of visiting the village, it was winter. Everybody slept in a big pile in the house. So the whole family slept together in one big bed, and the guests were stuck in the middle of the pile because that was the warmest spot. And they were really uncomfortable because these guys from Constantinople were like, this is weird. We are not into this, but we got to do what the locals want. So when I read about those historically, I feel like when we play medieval stuff, it's like a fantasy version of the medieval world, and it's not really like that. And so for me, knowing the 20s really well, because I've read so much about that time period and being in the modern day, that's the stuff that always interests me. Mike?
Yeah, I guess the one I really am interested in, this is weird because back when I was, in my younger days, it was in, the 1980s, and I was growing up in the 70s and whatnot. But so I'm attracted to scenarios set in the 70s, 80s kind of period, because there's a certain vibe, particularly to the 70s. Well, there is to both, but they're quite different vibes. As I always describe, when you watch a really good 70s movie, it kind of feels a bit grimy and dirty. And in the 80s, it's more kind of slick and polished. And society kind of mirrors that somewhat, if you look back. And so I think those provide interesting, backgrounds to scenarios that are written today, but set in what is now history, because they've got their own kind of definitions, those particular kind of decades. And so I think I'm particularly interested in those kind of things. And again, there's not a lot for those eras at the moment, although there have been some interesting scenarios done, particularly in the 80s kind of vibe in Miskatonic Repository and so forth. The other obvious one, which again, I've run a campaign, just a homebrew campaign set in the late 1960s, because again, it's a crazy time with a lot of things going on. And I think that just provides a really interesting backdrop to scenarios sometimes. So I think that kind of 60s through to 80s period is probably underexploited at this moment certainly in terms of Call of Cthulhu, and something maybe that will develop over time as we move forward.
I look forward to the scenario book.
We did. Me and my friends came when I was running the 1960s campaign. A friend of mine coined the term, "It's Cthulhu now, man." And
Cthulhu Bunga, is that anything?
I can totally imagine something set in the 70s, the kind of Studio 54, Disco Cthulhu. Can definitely imagine that being a really interesting setting, the whole nightclubbing world of New York.
Yeah, definitely.
One more question about the settings. All three of these cult scenarios are based in large cities, which is obviously great and familiar to a lot of people, but also quite a challenging choice in terms of player logistics and the amount of stuff going on. Did you find that challenging? And if so, how do you overcome it? Is the answer just get Mike and some other people to look it over when you're done?
No. I think city scenarios are a different animal because there are so many options. And I think that's good to give players ways to think outside the box or think of contacts. If you do something more rural, then there's less options, especially if they're stuck in a small town or if they're at a house. I've written scenarios where they're just at a house. I think the Mansions of Madness, I wrote one for that, the new one that just came out, or not just came out. It's been years now. No, but it's a different dynamic, and I think Trapped in a House are good for maybe one shots or quick adventures. With these, they're a little bit more complex. These are definitely more than one session, I think, for each of these scenarios, and in this, like I was trying to say there, in the city, there's more people you can talk to. There's more resources that you're able to tap into. And I think that that's fun for players. And it also keeps the GMs on their toes. You're right. It is harder because when you give them access to all those things, they can come up with crazy things that you don't anticipate. And they're like, oh yeah, I'm just going to go down to the steel mill. And you're like, oh, steel mill? And they're like, oh yeah, Chicago, there's got to be steel mill. And you're like, oh right, of course there'd be a steel mill there. Yeah, geez, I never think of that. So, that kind of stuff, it could be problematic, but I like that. And I think that more options is more fun, in my opinion. But yes, it makes it harder to write scenarios.
I mean, what Chris has said is absolutely true. I think the real plus side of city-based ones, where you've got a breadth of scenario, and particularly something like a Godstream, which has got a lot of breadth to it in terms of the actual cult that's involved. It allows not only the players to kind of, go off track a little bit and maybe come at the different challenges with some innovation and some new ideas that maybe, we weren't expecting, but hopefully, the keeper, is on point to kind of meet those challenges. But equally, it provides the keeper some flexibility and challenge as well, because, they can broaden things out. They can very easily create NPCs on the spot that the players are never going to meet again because it's a city-based thing, and reinvent how the clues may be found and so forth, and actually adapt to the players as they go forwards, perhaps, which is slightly harder to do when it's, as Chris says, a very small rural setting where kind of everyone knows everyone, and the investigators walk down the street and everyone sees them, including the cultists. Whereas in the city, the players, just like the bad guys, can get lost, and neither necessarily will see the other ones coming, until the appropriate point. And so it just allows the players some cover, but it also allows the bad guys some cover as well. So I think it kind of provides some more flexibility in how the story is told at, your particular games table.
And there's also an angle of it too, is I've lived in cities my whole life, so I also know cities better than I do a small town, even though I visited many small towns and my grandparents lived in small towns. It's a completely different dynamic and a vibe that I just felt more comfortable writing for cities as well.
The other thing to just add on, but again, as I was working on a Godstream, given the proficiency and size of the cult you're dealing with, they have so many options, and I could imagine, and Chris has already said this is very clearly not a one session scenario, and I could see this is actually the bones of a broader campaign. You could literally run a Godstream and throw in different new invented components that you've come up with as a keeper, to kind of really broaden things out, and so you could actually be just one part, or maybe the ongoing thread to the campaign that builds to a big climax. But actually, you can have lots of other things happening with the cult, on a much more lower scale that the players are interacting with. And actually, as they do that, they kind of then fall into the actual start of the investigation proper. But it just struck me that with the scale of the cult that it was, having it being able to expand outwards in terms of play would be a good thing, because I could imagine some groups really getting into that. And again, a city background to do that gives the room for that to grow.
Also, for that particular cult, we have them as one of the background cults in the book as well. So with that, you could easily build a campaign. Just because the way that the scenario ends does not mean that's the end of that cult at all. And now if anybody survived by the end, if there were survivors, they would be on the radar of this cult, and it could be a jumping off point for a campaign. And I think there's lots of interesting threads that those players can still explore if they were interested in that particular. I think we try to do that with every single one of those stories, that those cults, except for maybe not the middle one. The middle one had it could have been catastrophic for the cult at the end of that one, depending on how it got played out. So that might have actually finished off that entire cult there. But even in God's Dream, even if the characters blew up all that stuff, it was not the end of the cult by any stretch of the imagination.
Yeah, speaking of that cult, I think we definitely felt an echo of the Church of Scientology in the Church of Perfect Science. Yeah, just, I don't know, something in passing.
That's really weird. I don't know how you got to that.
No idea.
Man, I never saw that. Never saw that.
We were wondering whether the cults in Loki's Gift and Angel's Thirst were also inspired by real-world organizations, and come to that, the other cults covered in the setting book.
Well, yeah, more loosely, just the sort of the secret societies, the gentlemen's clubs, and in London at that time, there were so many of those different, the Order of the Golden Dawn, Order of the. I mean, if you go back and look, there's just tons of them. That was the popular thing to do for men at the time, and they just would go to these places, put a lot of money into them, and then get up to shady things, rich people. And I always thought that was kind of an interesting place for somebody to actually stumble on something that was real, like in the setting, a real powerful entity. They're not just dudes fooling around, fulfilling kinks. They're actually amassing power. And then what would that look like? And of course, the idea that there's a few in the know and they're going to manipulate all those other rich guys to give them more resources and power so that they can hunt down those things. I thought that was an interesting idea. So that's where that came from. And yeah, the Angel's Thirst, the one set in the 1920s, that there was a woman who had a cult. And I thought that was really interesting in Los Angeles. And they found a bunch of bodies. That's real. Like they found a bunch of bodies that she had under the building. And I don't think they ever identified them, if I remember correctly. It's been a while since I did the research on that. I think we wrote this in 2016 because I think all the stuff's sent in 2017. And I thought, oh yeah, this book, maybe it's 2015. I'm like, oh, this will be done in 2 years. No problem. I remember thinking that, and it didn't happen. No, but yeah, so I tried to find things that were sort of interesting and take little bits here and there. But there were a lot of these cults in Los Angeles. Or maybe cult's kind of a strong word. There were a lot of lost souls, and there were people there to take advantage of them. And, they take their money, or they would get them to work for them, or they would, do pornography or whatever way they can take advantage of them, they would. And I thought that was, again, talking about building cults, that's a whole section of the book where you find people that are looking for a place to belong. And that's the best way to get somebody hooked in. And once they're there, then you could kind of start getting them to do things that they probably wouldn't normally do.
And then there's the the start of the book with the various kind of different kind of cults that are kind of given a brief outline. There's kind of Lower Rising, the fusion jazz rock group from the 1970s.
Oh,
I mean,
right.
that's they're true, aren't they? I mean, that's we've all got those.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
When I read that, it just rung so many bells of like groups that were like, this isn't a million miles away from from many 70s rock groups.
Well, sure, or like going to Fish concerts, or the Grateful Dead. Where I've never been to a Grateful Dead concert, but talking to the people that were at those things, those were insane. Like people would just get super high, and weird things would happen. And one dude was telling me that a friend of his, this is a friend of a friend, so it's true. A friend of his said that he saw aliens, like really swear to God that aliens came down and listened to the Grateful Dead with him. Like that happened. That was a real thing.
Nice.
Obviously he was high at the time, and he says, oh yeah, I was totally high, but I don't think I would have saw him if I wasn't high. And I'm like, well, yeah, probably that he wouldn't have seen him if he wasn't high. Like that somehow made it real, because, I took drugs, so that shifted my perception to see the aliens that weren't there. It is like, or to hallucinate, which is what drugs do. I don't know. could be one or the other. But there was that idea to me that was like, wow, well, these places, people are really, they're messed up. There's a lot of them. Crazy stuff's going on. It would be really easy to take advantage of people. And I thought that would be a cool cult.
Speaking of cool cults, do you have a favorite out of the whole bunch? Or, well, I mean, do you have a favorite real world or fictional cult?
Well, boy, that's but the real world. And this is something Mike and I talked about. We try to stay away from the real world cult stuff as much as possible. I mean, obviously it's influenced, but that stuff's so sad and terrible. And all those people, like, the stuff with Jim Jones and, all those people committing suicide. And there are some references to that, because I feel like you've got to kind of acknowledge that that's part of it, but wanted to take a step or two back away from those real world things, because this is a game and it is supposed to be fun. And it's a strange thing about horror, is that you want it to ring true in one way, but then I personally don't want it to ring true in a separate certain way. Like if it's a little too real, like if I read a horror story and it has violence to children in there, I don't like that. But if some cultist is getting flayed alive, I don't care. It doesn't, it's like, oh, that's creepy. It's not that I don't care. It's just creepy, but it instills kind of a fear, excitement that I think that's why people are drawn to horror. Whereas sometimes if it hits a nerve that you're like, oh no, I feel uncomfortable and sad, like sad horror. I don't like things that go, oh God, that's just, no, that I don't want to, I don't want to be a part of this anymore. So there's that line that I feel like when I'm writing these things in these scenarios, that you want it to be sort of a little, creepy, definitely creepy, a little bit scary, even a little titillating in a way. But then there's those lines that you don't cross, and it's different for everybody. And that's the whole X card thing that's popular in role-playing games now, which I think is a good thing, where you talk to people before you start playing a game about, like, is there things that you don't like? And that's good. So I'm trying to anticipate things that other people aren't going to be into, and then stuff that I know I'm not into, I try to avoid that. Does that answer that? You're asking about real world cults. So no, I don't really have a favorite real world cult.
That's fair.
That's pretty good, because most of the time it's terrifying to me, like genuinely terrifying, especially when you see just big. I mean, I don't want to get political, but there's I feel like the cult of Trump is something that's insane to me, where I see these people acting in insane ways that it's what's going on? Why are these people behaving in this way? And a lot of those elements are cult-like type things, where people they're on board and they're going to do whatever it takes to fulfill this idea of what they believe is right. And that can be upsetting. But in a Cthulhu version, where they're praying to some ancient god and they're hoping that he's going to like them and give them some stuff or be nicer to them than other people, that's great. I love it.
Was there a favorite one in the actual book?
Oh, in the book, I think the one in God's Dream. What was the final name? Because we changed the name. What's the name of the cult?
The Church of Perfect Science.
That's it. Church of Perfect Science. Yes, because the name that I originally had turned out to be a real thing. And so I had to change it. Even though I did a search, I did an internet search, I didn't find it. And the Mike goes, no, actually, dude, this is real. And I'm like, what? Oh, damn it. So we had to change the name. So it's the Church of the Perfect Science is what it is in the book. Yeah, that's the one we ended up with. I think that's really neat. And I lived in Los Angeles for about 16 years and was involved in the filmmaking industry. And so there's sort of things that I learned about the filmmaking industry. I kind of slip a lot of that stuff in there as well, because I know the Church is the True Science.
Perfect.
What is it? Perfect Science. Church of the Perfect Science. Church of the Perfect Science. They use a lot of celebrities, obviously, in theirs. And so I was able to tie that stuff in and, write what you know. So that for me was the most fun group. Like one of them is a very popular celebrity whose rising star is going down, and he's the secret cannibal. And I love it. I think that's so to think of somebody like a Tom Cruise or a what's a John Travolta. Like if you found out they were like a cannibal, you go, yeah, you know what? I could see that.
We loved that cheesy NPC portrait. It was so good.
Totally.
Yeah.
I'm going to turn the same question over to Mike. So with the very reasonable caveat that real world cults are indeed very sad, but do you have a favorite fictional cult?
I mean, all the things that Chris said apply to real world cults. I mean, I'm interested in them, and I watch copious documentaries that turn up.
So do
but
I do as well.
I don't want to join one, and as Chris said, often it's just very troubling and sad and unfortunate most of the time. It seems the cult of Star Wars seems okay though. I mean, that's a modern day cult, isn't it? In Vader we trust and so forth. But in terms of fictional, I think. I guess I have a soft spot for the Elevated Order of Morpheus because it is Gaslight England, and I'm a big fan of the Gaslight Cthulhu by Gaslight setting, and so I really enjoy playing people like Cecil and so forth in as NPCs, and so I kind of enjoy playing those kind of characters. So it kind of it hits the button with me. I can't go without saying, though, the other cult in the book that probably doesn't get mentioned so much because it's not one with a big write-up, and it's really just used as an illustration of how to design your own cult for the game in the Creating a Cults chapter. Is this Chris came up with this one, wasn't me, but the mushroom cult, which I thought was just fantastic.
Yeah.
Yeah, they have their special space mushrooms that allow them to hear the dreams of Cthulhu, and well, then it all goes wrong, really, doesn't it? But it's a great kind of fun kind of setup for that, and I just like the idea of cultists kind of dealing shrooms to one another. And hey, I don't want those magic mushrooms. They're not the real stuff. I want the space mushrooms. So
yeah, that was based off like not that I knew any of these, but I used to work on 3rd Street Promenade in Santa Monica and in offices there, and so there were all these street kids that just were homeless, and they kind of had these they weren't gangs because they didn't really cause any trouble, but they just hung out there, and I knew a bunch of them lived in the mountains of Malibu. So there's these big woods out there, and a friend of a friend I went out to he built a shanty cabin out in the middle of the woods, like illegally. So he had this, it was really nice. It was like this really nice so he snuck up all this stuff. He had a secret way. There was no real path, and he had to go there a different way because if he kept going the same way, he would leave a path and people would be able to find the path to his house. It was crazy. So that was the whole inspiration of that cult, was these people that I knew, kind of mixing and matching to make it into one thing because it was different groups. But it was, I really like that one. That could have been a cool one. And then also the one entry of the guy that built a giant Cthulhu out of tires by the side of the road. I love that guy.
Yeah.
And his poor Cthulhu got burned down.
Aww.
I remember reading that. That was hilarious.
Yeah. And again, that's based on, there's all these strange artists. I was just last month, I was in Wisconsin, and there is this guy that built all of the beautiful artwork out of junk, like metal. And he's welded like giant spaceships and giant, like insect creatures and all these weird, it's insane. It's called like Dr. Zarbot's. Oh man, what's the name of it? It's just a roadside thing. You would never know about it, but it's if you go into these like guides, like Weird America, and it's huge. I mean, this area that this guy had, it's tucked away in the woods. You would never see it. If you drove by it, you would never know. You just have to know about it. And the idea that there was some guy who had this vision. He goes, you know what I'm going to do? Take what he has at hands, a bunch of old tires, and he's going to make this giant Cthulhu, and it's going to be exciting. So yeah, that's what I really liked as well. And it felt very American to me as well.
I loved all of the bringing in of sort of the artsy types in the various scenarios. Like it really brought home that it was Cthulhu related as well, you know. So
definitely, and how it was different kinds of art as well, like the little boy with the comic. Yeah, that was great.
Yeah, that's possibly one of my favorite little sort of NPC interactions ever. I was desperate to make that handout.
Oh
yeah.
Well, that would have been a great. I didn't even think of that. That would have been a great idea. But I guess it depends on your characters, obviously, to be able to fit in there. Yeah, I think a lot of that was because, and Mike and I were talking about going to the source, going to the Call of Cthulhu story and trying to take everything from that as much as we can and keep going back to it. Everything that Castro said, the idea that there was this event that artists and open-minded people or people that had some kind of different way of seeing things. Those are the people that are touched by Cthulhu and Cthulhu's mind or his dreams or whatever. And I remember that was just, we kept going back to that, kept going back. What does this mean? This thing that Castro said, where when humans become more like the gods, when they become more like that, then Cthulhu will come back, and there will be this ecstasy, and there will be a Holocaust, and there will be a new world, and we'll learn new things. So it's like, what does that mean? And it could mean so many different things. And that's kind of what we try to do, is trying to come up with different interpretations of that idea. And I think you can track back almost everything that happens with each of those groups into that, basically everything that Castro said, because he's the only cultist in Lovecraft stories that actually tells you what's going on, that gives it to you. Whether or not it's true or not, that's up for grabs. But we just went with it. It's like, yeah, why would he lie? Let's just go with this, and it's the truth as he sees it. So you got to look at it again that way as well, and extrapolate from there.
I have to ask at this point, if you were going to set up a cult, what would it be like? It sounds like you've got a lot of fun ideas boiling around in your head at this point.
What, for the game or in real life?
No, real life, I think.
the sad ones.
Maybe it is too sad. Listen, either. Go fictional with it. That's fine.
Well, I came up with a bunch of them for that game, so I think I might be culted out. I think that might be...
Which one would you like to run, though, as a head of the cult?
Oh, that's good.
They're all pretty terrible. They're all pretty mean. I guess I would make a new cult then that would be more about, like, helping people out and growing produce in your garden.
Oh, I like that.
That would be a good cult.
Good.
Very sustainable cult as well. Once Cthulhu does actually awaken and the world.
Trying to make eldritch-shaped vegetables.
You're going to make your own entertainment after the inevitable fall of the world.
Mike, same question for you. Do you have a cult you're just itching to run?
I have to... I hold my hands up and say sometimes I feel like I do already. I go to conventions and I meet a wide variety of people that play Call of Cthulhu who all have their questions and their interpretations of not only the scenarios but the rules and so forth, just like you might have with a religious text, different interpretations. And they all get together at these bigger kind of, gatherings. These rituals, where they undertake their own minor rituals, which we call games, and and they have a kind of they put their energy into it, and they come away feeling refreshed and energized and happy, and they have these tales that they share. So I think it already exists really for me in that way.
So they grow tales and then they share them. Tell us more about that part.
There's often you will find someone who will want to tell you about their game, or they might do a podcast and tell everyone about their experience and what they did and what they liked and what they didn't like and so on. So yes,
there's a lot of truth to that in a good way. I would say it's a good cult because it's benefits far outweigh any deficit that would come from being a member of this cult. But it's a connection. You're finding like-minded people. You're like Mike said, you're organizing. You're doing activities together. Yeah, and I think it's a pretty awesome cult. The cult of Cthulhu.
My title drop.
Well, you've got ritual items as dice as well.
Yeah, like we said, it is. It's a very positive thing, and it's a very energizing and liberating kind of pastime, and so
Absolutely.
it's all based around the concept of fun. Fun is our credo. Let's say that. Yeah.
Yeah, I love this cult.
And on that really positive note, I think we'll draw this first part to a close, and we'll come back next episode with even more questions for Chris and Mike and for the Stars Are Right cast as well.